Welcome back to New Day, and it's time for our legal desk. This morning, we're going to talk about something very interesting. We're talking about public interest lawyers. What are they? What are they about? What is the scope of the law? What motivates them? And a whole lot more. So I have with me this morning Francis Xavier Kojososu, who is from FX Law and Associates, and they deal primarily with public interest and human rights issues. Good morning, Francis. May I call you that? Or Esquire.
I'm sure Francis will do. Yeah.
Okay, how are you this morning?
Yeah, I'm doing well.
Okay, thank you.
I hope you are doing well.
I am. I'm doing very well. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me this morning and educating us about public interest lawyers and the law and all of that. So let's start off by defining what public interest law in itself is.
Well,
when we say public interest law, what do we mean?
Public interest law is the laws or the rules and regulations that border on the public. Maybe, simply put. For example, we have our constitutional laws. This is a public interest law. Our criminal code is a public interest law. If you look at the Pensions Act, you look at insurance, you look at banking, public interest broadly
It's broad.
is
So
the body of laws that border on anything that affect the
The
public.
people. So can we say that it has to do with the welfare or the well-being of the general public?
Generally so, and you can actually distinguish that from private law, which has to do with things like contracts,
right.
wills. These are things that people privately do, but the public is something that borders on the public. It borders on the state particularly, and state institutions, state agencies, and state actors. So anything that regulates the individual with the state, or that regulates the state's relationship with the individual, fall within the context of public interest law.
Okay, so generally things that are of appeal or relevance to the general public.
That is so.
Okay, so that is public interest law. So who is a public interest lawyer?
So by necessary inference, lawyers or practitioners who are interested in laws that borders on the system, that borders on the state, that borders on the state's relationship with individuals and with other agencies and so on and so forth. So for example, a public interest lawyer, lawyers in the Attorney General Department could be considered as public interest lawyers.
Okay, so it's not an area of specialization. Is it that every lawyer is a public interest lawyer?
Not necessarily, even though many lawyers, particularly in Ghana, where we do general practice, where I do sometimes contract, tax, and so on and so forth, almost every lawyer in his lifetime is more likely to come across with a number of cases that may border on public interest. Right. But then eventually your years of practice in those areas eventually define you as what people may call public interest lawyer, because at least there are many people who are just corporate lawyers. They are locked up in banks or in institutions
companies,
where they just company staff and so on and so forth.
The legal section of
and there are many others who are just criminal lawyers, defense lawyers. All they do is to defend people. It's an aspect of public interest because whatever happened to that individual borders on the larger society. But there are others who are also interested in the kind of practice that will engineer some social change, that will engineer some public reforms in the systems that we have.
Okay.
And these are people that fall into that,
Okay, so can we also define it as providing legal services for those without a voice or people who are in poverty, living in poverty and things like that?
Yeah, that is correct. I mean, we may say that all public interest lawyers, one time in their lives, will deal with people who do not have, the means, or who do not have the voice, and primarily because those cases are cases that they consider can engineer some social change.
Okay.
For example, recently you saw our case that we did on Francis Ejari, who was kept in remand for 14 years without trial. That is,
you were the lawyers,
yes,
well done.
And thank you. What Francis Ejari came out of prison All we heard was a news report on Francis Ejari concerning his plight, and he advertised that if anybody could be of help, being public interest lawyers and people who believe in human rights and all that, we called the station and asked, is there a way we can connect with Francis Ejari so we can see what help we can offer him legally? Indeed, when we met Francis Ejari, he didn't have the means. So first of all, we must consider, are we willing to put our resources, at stake to file papers for Francis Ejari?
And see through the whole process.
You're asking for 2 million, which will require a lot of, filing fees. Francis Ejari's coming to court is your cost. He would have to go for medical checkups. It's your cost. Facilitating witnesses that will come to give evidence. And this case took over 2 years. So it means that you are going to bear all this cost for 2 years, but only because you believe in the cause of justice and the cause of the transformation that case can bring in the system.
Is that your motivation?
That was my motivation, because I believe that it is completely wrong for somebody to be kept in remand prisons for over 14 years. It was 14 years, 6 months. Secondly, I believe that there are systemic failures in our criminal jurisdiction. Whereas the Constitution says clearly that a person who is alleged to have committed offense is presumed innocent until proven guilty. The practice, in fact, is that once you are alleged to have committed offense, everybody thinks you are guilty, including some judges, because the way they deal with those people clearly shows that they also are, moving on the assumption that these people are guilty. The investigator, the prosecutors, judges, everybody's, could be kept in check. And I believe that if we were able to pursue this case and get that very important declaration from the Human Rights Court, it can engineer some social change.
Okay.
And I am glad to say that case has indeed engineered some social change.
It has. Okay, let's talk about the monetary compensation awarded. You asked for 2 million Ghana cedis, but you were awarded 200,000. Are you satisfied with that, or are you going to appeal against the...
Honestly, we are not satisfied. But I can also say on authority that we don't have any instructions from your client to appeal.
So Francis is happy with 200,000?
Yes, he's okay. The reason being that monetary compensation was not particularly his interest. His interest was to, clear his name, that right. I was innocent, the police didn't do their work well, prosecutors didn't do their work well, and that's how come I was kept in remand for over 14 years. So even though the monetary compensation is not enough, he believes that he has got his day in court, i.e. getting justice, for all these years of unlawful incarceration.
Okay, is public interest law a lucrative field? I know you've said there are other factors that motivate you into doing what you're doing, but is it lucrative?
I think if you see it from my perspective, it is lucrative. And what is my perspective? My perspective is the kind of satisfaction I derive in putting smiles on the face of people who would otherwise not get anyone to help them do that. Right. For example, I recall the case of some 3 guys who were alleged to have committed rape and robbery. In fact, when you look at the facts that were presented and the evidence, that it was completely impossible for them the prosecution to ever. It's impossible for them to have committed robbery.
But these guys were remanded.
Yes, they were remanded, and I had to follow up. It took almost 9 months. These guys were kept in prison, for 9 months. But eventually, we were able to secure that very important release, and these guys are gradually putting their lives back. Indeed, they're contemplating suing, the state, including the newspapers that actually carry the story. They're like rapists, robbers, nabbed.
They never even say
alleged rapists, robbers, nabbed. And these guys were,
and they put their faces on the papers,
on the papers and all that. I felt that was very wrong. But the satisfaction I derived was the fact that eventually we were able to prove in court that there was no evidence supporting the charges.
How does this make you feel as a lawyer who's pursuing this agenda, human rights and public interest and all of that? All you have to do is to take a trip down to Nsawam and listen to some of the stories of the inmates there. How does it make you feel about the so-called injustice in the system?
Honestly, I feel very disappointed. I feel very disappointed because for all of us who are free out there, we are potential accused persons.
Yeah, just one accident or something away from being in Nsawam.
I've seen many people where people will just allege that, oh, well, he raped me. As I talk to you now, there is a case I'm working on at Medina cells, and this one I can always commend the police, for this, because they actually called our office and said, look, there is a case here. We think that if we don't take care, it will tend to be like Francis Ejari. So is there any way you can do something about it? When I checked, and today from here, I'm going there. There is this guy called Kofi, in that cells. And the reason why he's there was because a lady, his girlfriend,
accused him
that he committed, he raped,
And rape is a very difficult thing to prove.
So you can't actually grant bail because it's not bailable. Now, the one in charge, investigators, they prepare their docket, send a duplicate docket to Attorney General. Then everybody goes to sleep, because the guy has been kept in the remand. In remand by himself for the past 3 years, 3 months. The last time he showed up in court